Today, we are diving into the story of one of Australia's most iconic and, let's be honest, controversial figures, Ned Kelly. He's been called a folk hero, a revolutionary, a cold-blooded killer, but who was the real man behind that famous iron mask? And that's, right there, is the big question. It's the question that has echoed for over a century. Was he some kind of champion for the poor, fighting back against a corrupt system? Or was he just a violent criminal? Let's dig in and find out. And this is him. This photo, which is pretty haunting, was taken the day before he was executed. He was only 25 years old. Just look at that stare. It tells you everything you need to know about a life lived right on the edge. To understand the myth, we have to start with the man. So let's rewind. We have to go back to the beginning, to the rough, unforgiving Australian bush that made him who he was. You know, Kelly's life was practically defined by struggle from the get-go. His dad was an Irish convict, shipped off to Australia for stealing a couple of pigs. And when his father died, Ned was just 12, and suddenly he was the man of the house. That's a massive burden for any kid to carry. This was his world, a tiny, run-down shack. The Kellys were what they called poor selectors, basically trying to make a living on really bad land. They felt completely victimized by the system, always being pushed around by the rich landowners, the so-called squattocracy, and constantly being hassled by the police. That sense of injustice was just baked into his DNA. Well, it really didn't take long for all that simmering anger to just boil over. By the time he was 14, he was pretty much an apprentice to the famous bushranger, Harry Power. His teen years? They were just a revolving door of prison stints for assault, stealing livestock, and running with a local gang known as the Greta Mob. And people were noticing. Oh yeah, the authorities were watching closely. As early as 1870, the local newspaper basically saw the writing on the wall. They predicted he would become a declared enemy of society. And honestly, it turned out to be a tragic, self-fulfilling prophecy. These two pictures, side by side, they tell such a powerful story. On the left, you've got a mugshot of a defiant 15-year-old. On the right, he's a bare-knuckled boxer. This was a young man who was tough, incredibly proud, and just refused to back down, a combination that was going to lead him right to the point of no return. You know, for every outlaw, there's that one moment, that one event that pushes them right over the edge. For Ned Kelly, that moment was what we now call the Fitzpatrick incident. So the whole thing kicked off when this young constable, a guy named Alexander Fitzpatrick, shows up at the Kelly house. He's there to arrest Ned's younger brother, Dan. What actually happened that day is still a huge debate, but one thing is for sure, nothing was ever the same again. So we're left with two completely different stories. Fitzpatrick swore that Ned burst in and shot him in the wrist and that his mother attacked him with a fire shovel. But the Kellys? They said Fitzpatrick was drunk, that he was harassing their sister, Kate, and that his injury was an accident. The real truth is probably lost to history, but the consequences, they were devastatingly real. As you might guess, the court believed the constable. So Ned and Dan took off and went into hiding. But their mother, Ellen, she was sentenced to 3 years of hard labor, all based on Fitzpatrick's story. For Ned, this was the absolute ultimate injustice. His mother was in prison because of a lie, and he swore he would get revenge. And with that vow, Ned Kelly crossed a line. He went from being a petty criminal to a full-blown outlaw. This was the true beginning of the Kelly gang. So while they were hiding out in the middle of nowhere, Kelly and his gang ambushed a police party. 3 officers were shot and killed, and one of them was a constable named Thomas Lonigan, the very same officer Ned had once publicly vowed he would shoot. The line had been crossed. He was now a cop killer. The government's response was swift, and it was brutal. The entire gang was officially outlawed. Now, this wasn't just a wanted poster. This was a state-sanctioned death warrant. Under this new act, literally anyone could kill the gang members on sight with 0 legal consequences. The stakes were now life or death. And just to make sure the job got done, the government put up a massive reward, £2,000. In today's money, that is an absolute fortune. This turned the manhunt into a colony-wide obsession. But Kelly refused to be seen as just another criminal. He actually dictated this long, fiery letter, a manifesto really, justifying everything he'd done. He painted himself as the victim, as an enforced outlaw, pushed into a corner by a corrupt police force. He was fighting to control his own narrative. And this really illustrates the huge divide that was happening. On the left, you've got the outlaws themselves, but on the right, those are just some of the dozens of ordinary people, Kelly's sympathizers, who were rounded up and thrown in jail without a trial just because they were suspected of helping the gang. This heavy-handed approach totally backfired and actually turned public opinion against the police. So the gang then pulls off these two incredibly daring bank robberies. And they were bold, they were efficient, and weirdly enough, they were often described as being courteous to their hostages. These acts plus his letters really started to build this Robin Hood persona, stealing from the rich and just making a fool of the authorities. But of course, a life like that couldn't last forever. The final chapter of Ned Kelly's life is really what would cement his place not just in history books, but in Australian folklore. The end came at this tiny little railway town called Glenrowan, and in a final, desperate, almost mythical act of defiance, the gang came out wearing homemade suits of armor. Can you imagine? It was made from stolen plows. The bloody shootout that followed left the rest of the gang dead. Ned, shot dozens of times but somehow still standing, was finally captured. He was tried, convicted, and hanged. The historian Geoffrey Searle put it perfectly, I think. He said Kelly was a symbol of that wild, lawless Australia that was disappearing fast. A man fighting against the unstoppable march of so-called civilization, which was literally being laid down with iron railway tracks. And so that brings us right back to our original question. Why are we still so fascinated by him? What's the big takeaway? Well, the reason the legend lives on is because there is no easy answer. Was he a freedom fighter? A folk hero? A ruthless murderer? Some people even call him a terrorist. He's been called all of these things. In the end, maybe this quote from journalist Martin Flanagan says it best. The power of Ned Kelly's story isn't that we all agree on who he was. It's that more than 140 years later, we are all still looking. He's this fiery, unavoidable figure on the Australian horizon, forcing us to keep asking really tough questions about justice, about rebellion, and about what it even means to be a hero.